Thank you. Hopefully, I think it's working well, the microphones. So, good morning, everyone. And we are here, Boston. Mildly cool today, overcast, cloudy summer day. I think it's probably quite apropos to start talking about extreme weather. It is not an extreme weather day, but it is probably not the typical day. And I haven't taken a look at the ISO New England morning report, but maybe some of the solar isn't at full capacity or where it's expected to be if we had one of the days we had last week with scorching heat and bright summer. And I think it's personally a very important problem to tackle, and similar to how Jim had put it, it's perhaps a problem we hadn't had to tackle years ago when we thought about the electricity sector. And the difficulty lies in the fact that generally extreme weather, just by the English language version of it, is rare, but it's also very difficult to predict. And it does have a local quality to it. And I think folks think about it locally, like this other state or this other region or this other continent has extreme weather right now, but I don't. And I think that's sometimes a little bit myopic because it suggests that, well, I don't have to worry about it. I can't learn from my neighbors because the extreme weather in Asia, which might be characterized by flooding and typhoons, doesn't really apply to North America, or the extreme weather on the West Coast with wildfire risk doesn't apply to the East Coast. I think that's really not necessarily the case, and I think it's about reframing our understanding of extreme weather and the fact that it's hazardous to the power system, it's hazardous to humans. And if we think of it that way in terms of the consequences, maybe it's easier to then learn from each other about planning, policies, and operations. So with that, maybe 3 quick facts, and I'll introduce our panel. One quick fact, just to put everybody kind of in the mindset, is we have definitely experienced worsening weather. Jim Rabb also mentioned that in his introduction. I think you guys have all read it in some front page news story. NOAA data about ocean surface temperatures, highest levels ever since satellite imaging began, shattering temperatures across the temperature records across the U.S. with the heat domes, Washington Post, I think, yesterday had an article about the Earth broke all-time heat records 2 days in a row. So it's making for, I guess, sensational news. But if you dig a little bit deeper, there's a basis to it, and it's not just about heat, temperatures, or climatological changes like this. It's also about natural resources. The U.S. Geological Survey issued a report. I think it was probably last week, and there's a sentence in that report. It's a little bit funny, but I thought I'd read it. New satellite data confirms that every corner of the Earth has the incorrect quantity of water. So again, it's a big part of our infrastructure too, kind of, I guess, enlightening. And the severity of the impacts, the consequences I mentioned, are also another observation we should keep in mind. Climate Central, which is a non-profit that collects climate data and repackages it with findings, published a report in April 2024, just a few months ago, and noted of all the major U.S. power outages reported from 2000 to 2023, so over 22 years of data, 23 years of data, 80% of those outage events were due to weather. Now, this isn't transmission only related, it's across the power system, so transmission, distribution, driven events, generation driven events, but that is an outstanding figure. So this is really important to our sector. And of course, the building dependency we have with the energy transition that you heard of, the electrification, that only makes it more stark. So with that little introduction, to my, sorry, I'm dyslexic, to my left, to your right, we've got Mike Knowland with ISO New England. He's Manager of Operations, Forecast and Scheduling. and he's responsible for near-term demand forecasting and operating plans, gas-electric coordination, an issue we just finished up talking about a little bit, and reliability assessments. And prior to his current work, he was a control room system operator, so really in the fray of when extreme weather events happen, and served for 8 years in the US Navy nuclear program. Fun fact for Mike is that he is a very giving person, colleague, filling in very last minute from one of his other colleagues who was supposed to be here, and thus, maybe this is a good introduction, some of these faces don't look like the social media campaign, so, but we're gonna have fun today, so don't worry. Next to Mike, we have Maria Robinson with Director of Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office, really responsible for catalyzing all the development of new and upgraded electric, the office is responsible for the development of new and upgraded electric infrastructure nationally. Her team manages many of the funding opportunities that have become available through various legislation and federal programs. I think I got a statistic, I hope this is right, less than 2 years since the office was formed, it has handed out nearly $7 billion in funding for states, tribes, local governments, and private industry to support grid investment and operations. So we are very interested to hear from Maria about those programs. And fun fact for Maria, lifetime Girl Scout. Very amazing. And next to Maria, we have Stacey Burbure. Did I get it right?
Yes,
Burbure.
close enough.
Okay.
Close enough. I answer to Stacey, Tracy, Lacey. Any of it is fine.
Stacey is Vice President at AEP, responsible for FERC and RTO strategy and policy, leading the regulatory and policy efforts as the company develops the electric system of the future to serve its customers. She's been working on utility regulatory issues for over 20 years, and earlier in her career was with North America Electric Reliability Corporation. Fun fact for Stacey, hand model in a Nickelodeon commercial as a child. So with that, I thought I'd let the panelists start with a few opening remarks, and then we were going to go into a little bit of a curated discussion. I hope all of you get your questions ready and be prepared to participate.
Thank you, Julia. I think I saw that commercial. I watched a lot of Nickelodeon as a child. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Thanks to Wires, thanks to Julia, thanks to Larry and everybody else who invited us here to participate in today's discussion. My name is Mike Knowland. I'm the Manager of Operations, Forecast, and Scheduling at ISO New England. I have a lot of focus on a few different things. Gas-electric coordination is one of them. I think Jim Robb brought up a lot of the key points that I want to and need to talk about, especially in a forum like this today. Our focus in this group is obviously transmission, and I understand that. The focus at ISO New England for a clean energy transition, we tend to focus on energy adequacy, clean energy, balancing resources, and transmission is that fourth pillar of that transition. Energy adequacy is one of my primary focuses at the ISO. We see study after study after study that tells us that we're going to have growth in demand, which we all kind of have come to accept, and then also growth in renewable resources. That leads to the definition of extreme weather being different than it was before. Not as easy to define, unfortunately. You can ask 100 people what the definition of extreme weather is, and you'll get 120 different answers. And that's what we're trying to piece together. Over the last few years, ISO New England has worked with EPRI to develop tools to help us better define what extreme weather really means for our application to the power system. We're finding that extreme weather has traditionally, as it's been impactful to resources and supply and transmission, we also find that it's impactful to demand as well. It's not just the super cold or the super hot days that are considered to be extreme weather anymore. It's more longer duration. There's a time aspect to everything now. When we look at the supply and demand resources, they're impacted by What you would see is a calm day like today, where a day like today puts stress on the system as it reduces the amount of solar power that's generated throughout the course of the day, and that's going to put additional stress on the transmission system as it moves power around differently than it otherwise does. The way we calculate the amount of power we have available to serve the customers of New England, at least, includes generation, it includes demand, and it also includes ties to our neighbors. We calculate tie benefits, is what we'll call it here. A lot of other regions calculate their tie benefits in different manners. I think it's important that we push towards common ways to calculate tie benefits, so that we can come up with common problem definitions, common solution space, and assimilate the common assumptions. Again, my focus is on energy adequacy at the ISO. I've gotten pretty good at it. I am one of the folks who are in the middle of writing NERC standards to perform energy reliability assessments. I can't necessarily speak on behalf of the working groups, but I can offer opinions. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Hello, thank you for having me here today. Maria Robinson from just the Grid Deployment Office at the Department of Energy, and as mentioned, we've got about $22 billion to figure out how we can strengthen the both transmission and distribution system as much as we possibly can, and frankly develop new financing models as best we can so that everything becomes replicable. When we're thinking about extreme weather, I think our office is acting very differently than the rest of the federal government when we're talking about extreme weather, right? Almost all the rest of the federal government is in response to extreme weather that has happened before, whether that's FEMA in the immediate response, where they're just trying to stabilize the situation, but then there are all these other agencies including FEMA, of course, that are trying to do what we deem long-term recovery. And this is something that I think the Department of Energy is starting to get into. You might be familiar with some of our work around Puerto Rico, which is a unique, delightful space where we're definitely not running into a million different issues every single day of trying to rebuild that particular grid, but it's indicative of where I think the shift is going. Is we're not just looking at how you want to strengthen our existing system, but then figuring out, as we have additional funds through FEMA and a number of disaster supplementals, what are we doing to actually prevent this from happening again in the future? So not going too deep into things like the Stafford Act, which I know is probably very familiar with folks here, but trying to design in advance what is in a more sustainable system, what is a more reliable system overall, when you have to go back and do some of that rebuild, that when you're not just trying to stave off the worst possible situation in the moment in the 2 weeks following an event. And that's where I think our office can come into play with some of the planning pieces that we've been working on. We obviously have some of the big national studies, National Transmission Planning Study, coming to your inboxes soon. And we have the National Needs Study that really looks at those major interregional pieces that I know on the transmission system we absolutely need. But we're also trying to figure out how we break that into more regional assessments to help folks understand how they want to plan further out into the future, where you have everybody sitting at the table, and in part, now that we're looking at a future with 1920 in it, to be able to do that planning work. You'll see us over the coming months rolling out some programs for technical assistance for states and others to help figure out how to work with some of those planning entities who may not have been as involved before. So I think all of that work together can help us respond, not just in the moment, but helping when we get to the point of rebuild, make sure that everyone has the technical information that they need at their fingertips.
And I am not John Martinez with Burst Energy. I'm Stacey Burbure with AEP. And AEP is the largest transmission owner in the United States. We operate in 4 RTOs in 11 states: Arkansas, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Ohio, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. And yes, I did need notes to remember all of this. But that sort of footprint gives us an interesting perspective on issues like extreme weather. In the policy space, we have been advocating for interregional transfer capability for a while, and we have been advocating for reliability standards for the gas industry for over a decade. So we certainly bring to bear our experience in the policy space with respect to these issues and look forward to providing a utility perspective on this conversation and welcome the dialogue that WIRES has engaged in here, as this is clearly an important industry topic and one that we all need to lean into in our respective roles. So thank you.
So I was going to start with a couple of questions to the panelists, but feel free, start, I guess, raising hands, and there will be a mic coming around so that we can get the conversation started. Maybe, and this is taking a little bit of off on something Mike said, what is a good working definition for extreme weather, with a distinction between bad weather and extreme weather, but in the context of the power grid? Too much snowfall will be a skier's delight, but not very good, especially if it's mixed with some ice for the power grid. Just an example, and I thought I'd let you guys talk about it, and it could be from the experiences of recent events you've lived through.
So what we found after studying 75 or so years of weather that's been kind of transposed to 2027 and 2032 over 21-day chunks where we evaluate the energy that's produced over that period of time, is that it's not so much the cold weather event necessarily, it's the duration of the cold weather event. Most of our problems in New England are centered around wintertime. We certainly have adequate supply. We certainly have adequate capacity of generation. What we're finding is our competing with natural gas for heating demand is one issue that brings forth the energy issues that we see. You mentioned snow is a great thing for skiers. Not going to disagree with that. Snow falls on panels and sits there for days when it's cold. Solar panels, I mean, which inflates that. You could have plenty of sunshine, but if snow is in the way, you're not going to get that generation. We have over 7,000 megawatts of installed capacity of solar panels across all types in New England, from rooftop all the way up to the big solar farms, and that's quite a bit. That's distributed differently than traditional generation has been distributed. When we see this extreme weather, as we're trying to define it, I'll be two of the 120 answers you'll get from 100 people. It is that punch, that super cold, negative temperatures, very, very cold for a day or two. Yeah, that's extreme from one point of view. From the point of view of operating the power system, what we're finding is the German word Dunkelflaut comes to mind, where you see calm winds and cloudy skies for days on end. And the more we go through this evolution of the generation fleet from more traditional fossil-fueled resources to wind and solar, the more that becomes an issue. And the more we need those balancing resources than ever to make up for that effective loss of supply. So again, the definition of extreme weather is going to be different based on what your application is. When you're looking at transmission system elements, windy, a lot of precipitation. I see a lot of factors that play into things that cause outages. Is what you're gonna come back with your definition of extreme weather, or something along those lines. And again, it's just going to be what the extremes are going to be different based on the application. For us, it's prolonged duration, cold weather outbreaks, typically cold weather outbreaks, but it can be hot weather as well. It's that time aspect. You're adding a second dimension to everything we've ever known in the decades of operating the power system. We're now looking at the capacity of resources, but also the fuel supply that get to them, including wind and solar, and the duration of events that is more impactful than the severity in any instant of that event.
I think historically, building off of what Mike's saying, we only used severity as like the one definition, and now we're adding duration, and I don't have enough arms to do the rest of this. Another would be speed, like how quickly it comes into play, hurricanes, right, in particular. And then I think the fourth axis I would use would be unpredictability. Because if you can plan for it in advance, if you know that you're going to need additional resources, you can get that in a week ahead, day ahead, and you can start to work and make sure, see what it's looking like across the rest of the country. When a weather event comes in very quickly, it's so much harder to plan for, either to make sure that there are adequate resources. And I guess maybe a fifth axis then becomes, as if our goal is to increase interregional ties, right, in order to access additional capacity from across different parts of the country in order to help support during times of extreme weather events. If we start to get to the point where all parts of the country are experiencing extreme weather events at the same time, then that's a different problem to actually have to solve for. And I think, we're trying to do this on the back end of helping to provide some funding for different programs. One that is out right now is Hawaiian Electric is using AI and with some of their cameras right now to try and identify wildfire like the second that it starts, or identify the conditions that would allow for wildfire to happen prior to that. And so that's really interesting to buy them the extra half day in order to be able to plan that in advance. So I think there's a combination of all of these factors, and it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% on any one of them, but when you tie them all together, that's what ultimately makes something extreme.
Yeah, I think about that question much as the same way that Maria just outlined, with an emphasis on predictability. Yeah. So when does the sort of unknown or unexpected become expected? And when do we make that transition? We plan our grid under one set of assumptions and conditions, and we're constantly improving that modeling, but how do we sort of transition to make that more proactive than simply reactive to the past event that just occurred?
And maybe taking a little bit about that, and feel free, anyone can jump in. I was going to send it back to you, Stacey, but this idea of maybe mitigating through preparation, and kind of linking it back to the transmission. So Maria mentioned interconnection, so give us access to alternative resources. And from a preparation aspect, and I know I may be trying to recall John's ghost a little bit here. Is there things that you're seeing in your organization and with respect to kind of transmission system or grid kind of preparations, especially since you guys have assets and networks and different RTOs? Or how are you learning best lessons learned from one part of the country and kind of transferring it to another?
I will borrow a phrase from our VP of operations, and who really says that it comes down to trees, training, and tools. So the brass tacks of how we think about outages and responses to outages, which of course we know from the 2003 outage, and we know historically that trees are a main contributor in terms of vegetation management. So sort of maintaining best practices and tools, as well as personnel, and making sure, I'll give you an example, is that Columbus experienced a derecho event, that was very unexpected 2 years ago. And it was really one of the core lessons learned as part of that event was our communications with PJM and SPP, and having those real-time communications with your RTO and coordination and ensuring that everything was in place. We were both seeing the same facility ratings, et cetera. So sort of just those core building blocks and maintaining that in place is going to be even more important. Of course, we very proactively monitor system conditions. We have a team of meteorologists on staff that predict timing and severity of storms that may cause outages for our customers, which helps us better position crews and equipment ahead of the weather to speed up restoration events. This is something that all utilities, deal with in our day-to-day operations, and we continue to improve. And also as an industry, I think we do a fantastic job of sharing lessons learned. NERC actually prepared a report on the derecho event, which was very unexpected in the Columbus area. And really the emphasis of that report was on the communication that occurred between us and the various RTOs.
Maybe, Mike, I can turn to you a little bit, kind of taking on again this idea of what's done to support the grid and maybe transition from preparedness and planning to operations. How does the, in New England, sitting here today, we definitely have had events where a major transmission event on one of our interties causes problems in the broader system. How does that, how is that starting to filter into both planning and operations and planning for transmission investment as we think about those? Because, I think the superficial point from somebody who doesn't understand the industry would be, well, if those transmission lines are causing the problem, why are you telling me we have to build more? So how do we kind of sidestep those superficial comments? As part of my preparation for this, I reread our 2050 transmission study. One of the key aspects of that is that a one-to-one addition of transmission doesn't necessarily produce more transfer capability, and the transfer capability that needs to be kind of figured out. It was outlined through in the study of what upgrades or additions to the transmission system would be needed for the grid in 2035, 2040, and then 2050, expecting there to be much higher loads and then generation that gets spread around differently. Trying to make the unexpected expected, I think, is one key to that. The coordination and communication between control centers, not just between the ISO New England, for our example, the RTO control center and the utilities, that's just as critically important as the communication between the RTO or the balancing authority or the reliability coordinator to the generators, to the gas electric side of that, to ensure that everybody that needs to know the things they need to know in order to make the unexpected a little bit more expected, that comes to be one of the most important tools that we have in our toolkit. Going back to the 2050 study, you can see opportunities for where there's energy deficiencies and where there's energy surplus, and to be able to tie those two areas together to kind of expand your options when you have localized energy deficiencies, and to be able to make up for those with one of the tools being additional imports or additional transfers from outside the area. Thank you. Maria, can I ask you, well, you've got a bunch of TOs here in the room, and some other associate members like myself of WIRES that are constantly trying to work with the TOs, support the TOs, including engineering companies, technical advisors. Can you tell us a little bit about the programs that your office has that is trying to, the resources, I guess, that are available for the transmission sector to support improving the grid for these extreme weather conditions in the future?
Sure. So I think the big one as it relates to extreme weather, of course, is our GRIP program, so Grid Resilience and Innovation Program. I know you're all very familiar and have submitted lots of applications for those as we come through. Out of that $10.5 billion, right, we're seeing 10, 100. I don't have an exact number for you, but our oversubscription is out of control. And I think that is a really big question that we need to grapple with as an industry, is if the federal government is only able to handle a very small amount of this and we're all sensitive to ratepayer impacts, how are we actually going to make these upgrades in order to ensure that it doesn't cost $2 billion on the back end if we can instead invest $500 million on the front end? And that's like a very difficult conversation, I think, to have sometimes with ratepayers. But one of the pieces that I'm really excited about, honestly, is because our process of evaluation has really valued, thoughtful partnerships as we look through how we want to provide some of this funding. we've heard, at least anecdotally from a number of folks, hey, we didn't get selected for a GRIP grant, but it turns out that this all sort of pencils anyway, and these 5 of us who never would have otherwise talked to each other are now talking to each other, and now we're going to implement this program. And it turns out, we've been working with our utility commission the whole time, and they thought it was a good idea, and we never would have thought our commissioner thought that was a good idea. So those are things that I think we have to continue to figure out when there isn't this carrot of billions of dollars from the federal government. How do we keep those types of partnerships going? And that's something that's on my mind a lot, of how to make the impact, in addition to, of course, like great case studies and data for everybody to learn from all the things that we are funding, where we're really trying to do a lot of first of their kind, in addition to, a fair amount of vegetation management. So figuring out how we can spread that throughout the industry so everybody can learn the same lessons at the same time. And I think, again, that training piece becomes so important for everyone, so that, because you don't know, you might have a derecho in the middle of Ohio, you might find yourself with a wildfire in ISO New England, things that you're not expecting, you're suddenly experiencing here. But what I have learned is now I know who to call when we find out if the superintendent's trying to figure out whether to cancel or for snow or not. You probably have much better meteorologists than the superintendent. All right, great.
As I also kind of look at this industry and think about the affordability challenge, which we haven't really talked about too much. We've talked about tools and technical aspects of it. One of the things that strikes me is that extreme weather consequences, outages, are actually things that we have conventionally not thought about in monetary terms. We think about the cost of transmission investment, and they're very large-scale infrastructure, so have large price tags, but we fail to think about, we're doing much better job, I think, in the last couple of decades of thinking about the big dollar billion price tag, but then really down to the customer bill, it's not that big. But what we're, I think, still not doing as much of is thinking about what would happen if we didn't make that investment. And I don't know if any organizations are starting to think about it that way. In other words, to try to monetize the benefits of avoiding or mitigating some of the consequences of the long duration extreme weather that we talked about, or thinking about ways to build up a more resilient system to avoid those consequences, what the benefits are. Just thought I'd throw it out, and whoever wants to take it.
You want to start?
Sure, I'll start. So the value of transmission, that's really what we're talking about. We Wires, as an organization, talk about that all the time. And one of the things I was really heartened to hear Jim Robb sort of talk about that in a very frank way. It's going to be very expensive. We need a lot of transmission, but it's also the most affordable way to move us forward, towards this electrification that is needed. So, but that requires us to think longer term. I often reflect on the fact that AEP's 765 kV backbone network, at the time it was built, it was the first of its kind. And I frankly don't have confidence that we would have been able to build that same system today, based on how we think about the value of transmission. So, I think one of the things that's incumbent upon us, as we think about this question of affordability, is also to think about it in terms of value, and to think longer term in terms of these investments. These are, long-term facilities with a long-term life, and we have to, in a comparative manner, sort of stretch ourselves to think about it over that long-term course and acknowledge that we are in a different era. This is going to be expensive, and absolutely affordability has to be one of the components that we think about, but we have to accept the fact that costs are going to go up.
So I used to work the shiny building up there at the State House. And I think what was amazing to me is, right, I work in this industry, and I know that our grid is at the edge of its lifetime, is like the nice way of putting it, because we don't want people to panic and think that our grid is actually falling apart. But I think what's really was amazing to me is all the people I work with up there and all of my constituents assume that the utility is doing like absolute top of the line work, and that like every time you come out and you dig on the street, that they are getting like the top of the line technology, and that you should be able to provide complete, consistent power 24/7, no matter what is going on, or it should like come back on within 5 minutes, right? The expectations are so vastly out of line, I think, with the reality of what we know about our system, which is that there are days when we are holding it together with a little bit of duct tape on occasion, right? And I think that, I say that jokingly, that's not reality. But I know, no quotes on that one, but I know that we understand how fragile the system is, but the expectation is that, yeah, if we have 15 days below 20 degrees in New England, the grid should still be fine. And we all know that 15 days between 20 in New England, that can be a little rough, and we may be facing some issues there. So I think it's trying to balance that expectation from customers and from lawmakers, right, with what the reality is here. The other piece on affordability, I think, and this is where it depends on what your mix looks like, is that the idea is on bills, if generation costs are going down, it's okay if transmission costs are going up. If ultimately the bill at the end, right, even I don't always look at my bill as closely as that to see how much my distribution costs are versus my transmission costs. It turns out that my meter was broken for 6 months and I didn't notice. So that's not, so if I'm not looking at it, chances are no one else is looking at it. They're looking at the overall cost. So the idea then becomes, how do we shift that, knowing that a lot of different generation sources are getting, dirt cheap to accommodate for that change in ratio between the D and T.
As a system operator, cost is kind of baked into the system as I receive it in the days that are upcoming. So I don't really get the chance to spend a lot of time thinking about what the costs were to build the system that I have to operate today. What I can put a plug for, though, is common analysis methods. Information is very powerful when you're trying to make decisions, and to have as much information at your fingertips to make those decisions, and have them be common among all of the different entities that are involved, so that there's a common understanding, I think, is important. The tools that we've been developing over the past couple of years are generally becoming almost industry accepted tools for energy adequacy. At least we're trying to sell them that way, to produce the same result for a variety of different neighboring areas or across the country would be ideal. To come up with the same answer, to be able to make those more informed decisions, to have that, again, that information available at your fingertips when you're making the decisions to reduce the cost. And I understand that that's essentially the goal. My focus, again, is on reliability. That's 100% of what I'm concerned with. But to be able to have that information available, I think, is key.
I wanted to take an opportunity and see if there's any questions in the room.
I think it's safe to say there are some.
Okay.
Craig, we'll start with you.
We have time for
Craig never has questions. Come on.
Craig Glazer, PJM. It's good to see all my friends here, so I appreciate it very much. I wanted to focus on this issue about resilience. We've spent a lot of time now talking about long-term planning, but I'm not sure where the topic of resilience comes in. It's one that we had, frankly, the PJM had raised with FERC in a variety of dockets. Because a transmission system can be reliable under meeting NERC standards, but not necessarily resilient. They are sort of two different concepts in some ways, related but different. You can be reliable, but not necessarily resilient to things happening in the future. I'm not sure where this issue stands, and particularly looking at Mike in terms of the NERC process. There are limitations on how much NERC can do to address this issue, given the definition of reliability in the statutes. But I'd be interested in everybody's thoughts. Everybody can say, well, my utility is planning ahead, et cetera, but I worry about the lack of some common baseline on resilience. What are we supposed to do? How is it defined? What are the pinch points that we're supposed to be looking at, like we have with reliability standards? So I'd be interested in the panel's comments on that?
Craig Glazer from PJM always zings me with a question that I don't really have an answer to right off the top of my head, but I'm going to try anyway. Thanks, Craig, for being here. I look forward to meeting with you after this. All for good things, trust me. We have the 1 in 10 standard, right? And that's the standard that's been accepted since, I think, 60 or 70 years now. And then as the resource mix changes, I think the sheer definition of resilience, just like the sheer definition of extreme weather, I think it changes. You're looking at a possibility, and I don't want to guarantee this, but there's a higher possibility with all the variability and all the unpredictability of the resources that we have of a higher risk of outages, of shortfall. And to quantify that risk, I think, is important, but to be able to recover from it is just as important. If you put, if you're trying to figure out the right words, if you put the right resources in place, be it storage, generation, transmission to share between neighbors, you put yourself potentially so you don't go over that edge. You don't find yourself in shortfall because you have the opportunity to take what you have and either save it for when you most need it, and that could be either battery storage, pump storage, hydro, stored fuel. It could even be the transmission of natural gas from one area to another, and then the transmission of electricity from one area to the other. But in terms of resilience, what I always think of when it comes to resilience is how do you stop it from falling apart? One way to say it. And how do you bring it back quickly after it's fallen apart? And that answer is going to change as the resource mix changes. I wish I could just tell you the answer. I can't. You commented a little bit on the NERC process, and that's something I'm growing familiarity with and trying to learn a little bit more. The more I learn about the NERC process, the more I realize I don't know anything about the NERC process. But that helps me to understand, to your question about resilience. What can they do? I think it needs to be clearly delineated who can do what and how, and then plans have to be kind of set so that the right organizations have the power and the authority to do the things that the people expect them to be responsible for.
Just one example: a substation could be reliable, no problem with it, except
Sure.
that there's an extreme flooding situation that happens. Not even predicted, not even within a floodplain. And now the question is, whether the substation is out, or a bunch of substations are out because of flooding.
Very good example.
Is that a NERC standard issue, if it's particularly not in a floodplain? Or is that a resilience issue? We should somehow get proactive and,
I could see some.
The resources.
I could see some places in the NERC standards where things like that would fit. Again, it's an arduous process, so I don't know how easily it would be to incorporate that into transmission planning standards, for example. Even operational standards as you see storms coming through to bolster the system in that way. It's not just necessarily recovering that, but to be able to operate without it if you need to. Yeah, thanks, Craig.
One thing I would just add to that, Craig, is that, while I acknowledge that I'm an optimist, there are certain elements of Order 1920 involving common assumptions and coordination amongst RTOs, that can potentially contribute to that overall question of resilience. Looking at and modeling the same substation in the same way with the same assumptions, it should create sort of a better overall picture that would contribute to that.
And if I can jump in on Craig's question, although I'm not a speaker, but I want to maybe mention something, which is that we typically think of transmission technology as very well established, mature, but there are technologies out there as we think of pairing, for example, energy storage at substations, voltage source converters who could help us come out of a blackout because they have certain reliability services, as Jim talked about, inherent in parts of the equipment. So I think it's maybe thinking a little bit outside of the box of convention, even as we look at the types of investments we make.
But I think there's also the ongoing question. Yes, there's the NERC standards, there's what FERC is requiring, but then there's a separate conversation of the states and what states are going to accept as part of that, right? Like, the one thing that I was really mad about that I didn't get when I was on Beacon Hill is whatever reason, the very first time created a mission statement for the Department of Public Utilities, and they had like reliability and like these are the things that we value and want to think about. And I had an amendment in to add resilience, and because I couldn't define it as specifically, they wouldn't accept it. But I was like, I think this is a thing that the DPU should be thinking about as part of their investments in the future years. And so, you know, as much as we're talking about big interregional, multi-state, like a lot of this is actually what needs to happen at the inside a single state level, and that's a different conversation of figuring out how in state law you change it so that there's some cost allocation methodology for that, which is a much more complicated uphill battle.
Hi, Rehana, Irani Family. Thank you for all of your time. Question for you in planning and in how you see this future of grid. How is flexible load, large flexible load, or aggregated load, how is that fitting into your planning for extreme weather conditions or even the design of the grid needs?
I think that flexible load is dispatchable flexible load that can be kind of optimized inside the control room, the central control center for the entire power grid. I think that's that can be a valuable resource. To be able to dispatch a megawatt of load, you're going to get a megawatt of response. If I count on a megawatt of solar, for example, it's not going to be necessarily a mega. Jim Robb said at night there's no sun. We're pretty good at forecasting that at this point. To have that dispatchable load. We looked at this, and I forget what the actual numbers were. In our 2050, and I encourage you to look this up and check me on the numbers, but in our 2050 transmission study, and this wasn't an extreme weather study necessarily, but we did look at, you know, with the electrification of as many things as we can possibly electrify, it seems. We saw 57,000 megawatts of peak load in the winter time. And that means, you know, we're electrifying all aspects of heating, not just the blower on your furnace and things like that, electric vehicles and the like. The reduction from 57,000 megawatts to 51,000 megawatts on peak, I think I'm not going to quote a number because I forget what the number is, but that was the biggest savings across all of the things that study looked at. And that study looked at transmission expansion, it looked at generation expansion, reducing that load from 57 to 51,000 megawatts on peak. Saved, I want to say it was 50%, but that seems too high off the top of my head. But it was a considerable amount. Once you got above 51, the cost was significantly higher per megawatt added of demand. We have a good amount of dispatchable demand now. We also have a fairly good amount of demand that we don't dispatch from the ISO New England control room, but we know about it, and we can react to it happening. It's utility controlled, and we're growing an understanding of it, so we see it there. Intended to shave peaks, so when we get to the peak of the day, we can see that that load tends to go away, but that load's going to come back. And when that load comes back, we lose that diversity of load. So when that load goes away, it's batteries, thermostats, and things like that. When we get to the point where we electrify everything, that load, if it's the exact same load, the exact same customers that it is today, that'll be more of an impact on that peak. But it comes back, and when it comes back, it all comes back at the same time. So coordination of that, I think is very important. Understanding that is the second most important. If you can't get full coordination and full dispatch of that load, then at least a solid understanding of what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and what the impact is expected to be. Over the course of a day, I don't think that the energy piece of that changes necessarily. I think you might shut off for your examples, just think about it from your house. You could shut off your air conditioner when it's really hot out, but when you turn your air conditioner back on, if everybody turns their air conditioners back on that dispatch from the utilities, they're all coming back on at the same time. And then on top of that, you let the temperature in your house drift up, you're going to run that air conditioner a little bit heavier through the course of the rest of the day to bring your temperature back to where you like it, where it's comfortable. So the energy profile of that, And when we're looking at the future, the energy profile, I think, is a lot more important than that capacity piece. Load's an important aspect of it. I mentioned earlier on that demand is very much a part of my extreme weather concerns, much more than it used to be, for a lot of different reasons. But electrification is one of them. The expanding demand makes it that much more important. And then there's the demand side resource, the solar panels on my house, for example. They kind of count, depending on how you're looking at it, as demand reduction. So that piece of it is something else to consider there.
So I have a question. I think this discussion is really interesting, particularly as it touches on the issues around affordability that we keep hearing about over and over again with respect to the needs of the grid. But in this context, I keep thinking back to the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That too often we don't see the value in some of the efforts to bolster the grid, to create a more resilient grid, until after something bad has already happened. And then we go ahead and make all of the corrections and the investment in the aftermath of that. I think a little bit to my experience working at PSEG, I came there a few years after Superstorm Sandy. They were still talking about it then. New Jersey embarked on a pretty ambitious investment program to try to address those issues, but of course that was after the fact, right? I guess what I'm curious about, Maria, you touched on this a little bit. I'm interested in hearing more. What can be done, what needs to be done with respect to engagement with state commissions and the states on the value of these types of investments so that they can be made as an ounce of prevention rather than later on a pound of cure after the fact. Curious as to what your thoughts are on how best to try and accomplish that. And that's for all of you, not just for you, Maria.
Yeah, well, the joke that we like to make is no one has yet to write a story that says federal government does job, nothing happens, right? Like, and there are so many of my friends who work in like pipeline hazards or something where that's their job every day, is for nothing to happen, right? And it's hard to get folks excited about that versus solar panels, right? Everyone loves doing a ribbon cutting in front of a solar panel somewhere, right? And that's such a different type of tangible piece here. But that type of, I think we have to help people understand, and I actually think, so we're seeing Florida, California, the insurance companies starting to force this as an issue from that perspective. Not saying that I want that to spread any further than where it is, but I think it might be inevitable at this point that as more extreme weather hits, insurance companies are going to back out. And so then that becomes a different way of looking at insurance, is investing in things like our grid is a type of insurance. And when I talk to people about it like that, that tends to shift a little bit. Again, it's hard. State commissioners will go, well, that's not part of my regulatory compact here, is to do insurance, but helping them understand. The other part being, of course, that they're not always necessarily on the hook for the full costs, right? Because oftentimes federal government, if some extreme weather comes in with FEMA and additional funding that way. And so it's a hard gap there, but I think it's getting them to understand that this is going to happen no matter what. And the more states that talk about the experiences that they've had, and I'm sure we will have a lot, like 75 case studies coming out of Texas over the next year or so, we can help prepare others for something similar.
Appreciate the panel. I just wanted to comment that last week it was interesting that it was 4 of the mutual assistance regions were all active. And we in New York had tornadoes hit, which is unusual for our footprint. And this year alone, I've had 6 major storms, 5 of which are in the top 10 of my worst storms in the past 20 years. I'm now trying to upskill my ability to forecast at the very regional, local level, and how to predict how I bring on contracting crews to be ready. So I liked your trees, tools, training quote. Stacey, how are you, but I was interested about what you were saying about the weather forecasting that ISO's doing. How mature do you think we are in this industry? It's for the long term predicting, but it's those short terms that really bite us with the impacts to the grid.
I see a lot of the macro forecasting is as good as it's ever been. Better than ever. What's the temperature going to be today at noon and whatever? That stuff's easy. The micro stuff, you're effectively, you said 10 to 12, however many lifetime things you have never seen before. You're forecasting the unimaginable, which is a challenge. You know, I've seen the analysis capabilities and the number of studies that have been going on over the last few years that I've been involved in it, skyrocketing. We're trying to invent the unimaginable so that we can see what would happen. Nobody before last week, and I saw those storms. Friends of mine showed me some videos of those storms as they came rolling through upstate. It looked terrible. I couldn't imagine that being the case. And to forecast at that level, tornado forecasting is nearly impossible, right? You get that, everyone gets that. I'm sure that there are advancements in that, but I still think it's as good as Twister. Remember the movie from the 90s? I still think it's as good as that. The challenge I see is from your point of view, what you're looking to do is dispatch crews to put the lines back together, to put the system back together. I'm trying to see it from the aspect of that lost load coming back, and to make sure that when you're ready to close that breaker back in, that I have the generation online so I don't have to stop you from bringing your customers back. Because I have the generation online, ready to go, ready to serve that load. Cloud cover is the most difficult thing I've ever seen try to be forecast. We've been working at that for 10 years, and it's a challenge. Tornadoes are another one. The micro extreme weather situations, they're so unpredictable, and where, when, how impactful it's going to be. Does it matter? You know, you're trying to forecast now. You're looking at, is there going to be a tornado? You could tell me with 100% guarantee that there's going to be a tornado, and that's just one aspect of it. Where is it going to be? When's it going to hit? What's there when it hits? Is it a school where today it's probably not as big a deal as it would be in 3 months, right? You have all of the factors that go into that. The predictability of some of these things, and even looking at the big events, the Elliott, the Uri, the other named storms that I forget their names. Nobody imagined that could happen. It can't get that cold in Texas for that long, and then it did, and now it can. So to try and predict that is a challenge. You know, you kind of have to dream up scenarios that can't happen and study them, just to have an idea of what would happen, and then you get back to the resilience of it. You know, what do you do about it? I wish I had a good answer for you, but I don't.
The one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I know that data sharing is always a complicated issue, but I know that also is changing as we are all facing the AI situation, which is separate, equal challenge. But after what happened in the heat dome in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory invested a lot in some of the weather predicting models. And I think it's worth taking a look at what they're doing there, because that is some of the best in class work that's going on with some of the weather prediction and at more of the micro level than you would expect coming out of those things. Also, there's a new Twisters movie.
I'll have to check that out.
Doesn't solve the problem, but
Did they? Never mind.
yeah. Well,
All right, we have time for one more question, and then we'll take a short break, so take it away, Bill.
Thanks, Larry. Bill White, Norton White Energy, great panel. So when I listen to what you're all talking about planning, there was a time when we did planning and forecasting for demand. We didn't think about things like LED light bulbs, and now we do, or energy efficient heat pumps, and now we do, or extreme weather, and now we're working on that. So another group of things that I don't think are really in the forecast yet are grid enhancing technologies and high performance conductors, among other things. So we have a lot of technologies that affect the transfer capacity of the grid, I just wanted, how do you see that evolving? How do you see that is anything happening, or is it on the horizon, or is it something that, we've seen deployments by utilities of these technologies around, but how does it come into planning and forecasting and what you could and couldn't do, or scenarios or things like that? Thanks.
Sure. So I'll start. Grid enhancing technologies is definitely part of the picture, and it always has been. That's not to say that it's a panacea for every solution and that it is going to replace the need for new infrastructure. But many utilities, including AEP, consider grid enhancing technologies on a routine basis. I know that First Energy, for example, has a technology center where they test new technologies before they implement them on the grid. So as a routine matter, this is certainly something that every utility sort of bakes into its practices. And something that FERC has been actively considering as well. And of course, there's an ANOPR on that. And we have to also consider not only grid enhancing technologies, but also system design, right? As we are thinking about what conditions do these new structures need to withstand, right? To Larry's point about flooding substations and the work that was done in PSEC, right? So that sort of forward-thinking investment is something that we have done historically and will need to continue to do and to reflect sort of new conditions. When does a tornado, in the New England area become, part of your new building criteria going forward? At what point does the unexpected need to become expected? That's definitely something that we consider. And also, I think it's something that we as an industry should continue our partnership with NERC on as well. It's definitely part of the reliability conversation. Having been counsel to the NERC Standards Committee and drafted a version of the standard process manual, yes, it is very complicated. There's always room for improvement. But certainly how we think about and test those technologies, because they also can create risks on the system. So particularly in the cyberspace. Are we creating vulnerabilities? We, as utilities, tend to be, very cautious about how we approach those risks and thoughtful with respect to implementation, because it's also about scale, right? So if you adopt something, particularly on a large scale on your system, have you created inadvertent vulnerabilities that could be exploited? So, as Jim Robert, very eloquently, outlined, we as utilities are facing threats by nation states. So how we think about that has to reflect, a very thoughtful and measured approach that is indicative of those threats.
All right, well, thank you very much. Everyone join me in thanking this panel. It was a terrific discussion.